We're really excited. Our audience is growing, and I think I'm hoping that means that people are just more concerned in general about their environment.
I've been involved with sea run brook trout for 25 years now. I got involved with a project down in Plymouth and Wareham called it was Red Brook Restoration. It's on the Lyman Reserve, and we got involved with that because Hal Lyman wrote a letter to Trout Unlimited and asked them to take the land. And over time, it's kind of a long story. We did reach an agreement in 1991 with the Lyman family, but then eventually in 2001, we signed a memorandum of agreement with the trustees of reservations, the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and Trout Unlimited, and set up a management plan. And so the management of that property now is handled by these three entities. Over the course of those 20 years or so, we did a lot of stream monitoring on the brook. It was a salter stream, and we ended up taking 4 dams out with the help of the Division of Ecological Restoration, which is a great resource in the state. Also, the state ended up, after the 4 dams were taken out, the last one in 2009, the state went and bought the 245-acre makepeace, 80 makepeace Century Bog. So the total amount of land that is protected now along Red Brook is 883 acres. And it's essentially the whole length of this salter stream. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of my experience with salters. And in 2009, a few of us got together and we decided that we wanted to put a magnifying glass on salted brook trout and on our coastal streams. And so we started an organization called the Sea Run Brook Trout Coalition, of which Jeff is now the CEO. And what transpired over the next few years was over $100,000 has been raised, and all that money's gone towards projects that benefit sea run brook trout, or projects that do research on sea run brook trout. So this is a nice red brook salter from March of 2008. This was caught in tidewater. This is kind of what they look like. So we can call it a salter because it was actually caught. It was caught down by Red Brook Road and was in tidewater. This is a little trout, brightly colored trout. You see a lot of diversity in these fish. So one of the things that I want to address right away is that it's very hard to tell if a trout is a salter or not just by looking at it. One of the surefire ways that we have now is that, because of a tagging program, we can more or less tell that they've been down in salt water. This is one of the biggest salters that I think we've gotten out of Red Brook. We know for sure that it's a salter. You can't tell by the coloration, obviously, but we know it's a salter because it was tagged. It went down to salt water after the spawning period in November. And it came back in the spring, and over the course of one winter out in Buttermilk Bay in the salt water, it grew 4 inches. So it went out there basically as a 12-inch trout and came back at 16 inches. So a salter is it's a brook trout. Its Latin name is Cevelinus fontinalis, and what that essentially means is it's a char of the springs. I'll point out that actually brook trout aren't really brook trout. They're a member of the char family, and one of the ways that you can tell the difference between a char and a true trout is the fact that on the trout, the spots will be dark against a light background, and on a char, the spots, if they have them at all, will be light on a dark background. And then there's some other more technical differences too that have to do with their teeth and whatnot. Char also are cold water fish, and they like the water colder than a lot of the trout species do. This is the range of our brook trout. This includes both the eastern brook trout and the western brook trout. And the range of the salter of coastal salted brook trout is right along the coast all the way up into Hudson Bay. And when we talk about sea-run brook trout, a lot of times people ask if they're like salmon. Do they have to go out to salt water? They aren't like salmon. They aren't obligated to go out to salt water. When brook trout go to salt water, they do it opportunistically. They basically do it because they're looking for more food and because they're able to do it. After they get to a certain size, it's much easier for them to do it. So any trout in a coastal stream that has access to tide water is likely or is capable of becoming a salter. There's been some genetic studies done. There might be some connection between the speed of the metabolism and whether or not an inherited speed of metabolism and whether or not a trout will go out to salt water, but that research really hasn't been finished yet. This is kind of a rough approximation of our brook trout streams here in Massachusetts, and you'll notice that most of those streams are in the western part of the state. And you'll see some streams down here that are really important for our purposes. There's the Cape streams, there's the Westport system, there's some streams up here in the North River system. And the reason that this side doesn't look like that side is because most of the people in the state live right here. This is the most heavily developed part of the state. It has the most dams, and it's got the most impervious surface from roads, that sort of stuff. So a lot of the streams have just been wiped out. This is the map of our wild brook trout streams and our coastal brook trout. So this again is a rough map. We're finding out more about where these fish live every year. And the state Division of Fisheries and Wildlife just doesn't have enough time to explore every single little stream in this part of the state. But every so often they stumble across a new one. So you'll notice that this is interesting. There's some very nice trout streams on Martha's Vineyard. And then you have the classic Cape streams, which actually were the mainstay of our sport fishery for sea-run brook trout. And then when you go up here, you'll notice in the Marshfield, Hanover, Pembroke area, there's quite a few streams. Those are streams that still support wild trout in the North and South Rivers watershed. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was brook trout are our only native trout in Massachusetts. And I think for that reason, one of the reasons why when we got involved with trying to restore brook trout down at Red Brook or on the Quashnet River, for instance, on the Cape, one of the reasons that these fish became special was because when we found out that they were our only native trout, it just seemed right that we should be trying to do what we can to try to bring back their habitat. I'll actually get to this a little bit further on, but this is an example of things that, from long, hard experience, don't work, and not, at least not for brook trout, and certainly in a very limited fashion for other species of fish, even for alewives. And the fish ladders are better than nothing, but that's about it, as far as I'm concerned, anyway. Some of you might recognize this dam, my favorite dam. This is Ludham's Ford in the summertime in low water. Now the thing about hatcheries, it provides a fishery. It's a put and take fishery for people, but it doesn't solve the issues around wild trout at all. In fact, if anything, hatcheries more often than not work against wild trout, and we'll get into that a little bit further on too. So again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but this is solutions that we find are working today to restore wild brook trout. And as you can see, land conservation is a big one. Dam removal, as we did at Red Brook, for instance, certainly helps restore connectivity and cold water for cold water fish like brook trout. Then to carry that further, dam removal is actually part of habitat restoration, but to carry it further, for instance, at Red Brook, what we did was, once the dams were taken out, we put a lot of wood in the stream. And the reason we put the wood in the stream was because that's what would happen naturally. And the wood acts, let me say the technical term would be for ecological complexity. So the wood grows bugs, the wood provides cover for the fish, the wood provides habitat for, grows bugs, insects, that sort of stuff. It scours the bottom of the river, and it creates holes, and it also helps shape the river. Helps create meanders in the stream, and the meanders in turn create undercut bends and banks and that sort of stuff. So it adds complexity to the stream. So that's part of what habitat restoration is all about. And a very untechnical word for that is rewilding. And it was interesting when we started throwing all the wood into Red Brook. We got but we got some nasty letters from fishermen, fly fishermen, who were losing their flies on the logs that we'd put in there, and asking why we weren't clearing the brush along the stream and why we weren't cutting the wood out and making it easy for them to fish. And the obvious answer is, it's about the fish. It's not about your fishing, it's about the fish. And once you learn how to deal with that stuff, actually you'll catch more fish. Okay? So protect, reconnect, and restore, by the way. That's kind of like the mantra when it comes to working to restore sea run brook trout. In the north and south river watershed, there are at least 10 brook trout streams with wild populations. The problem is that almost all these streams are cut off. They're actually isolated in small pockets above dams. And because the state knows about them, they are protected by cold water fisheries regulations, and we can get into that a little bit later. But as this says, bad culverts, dams, that sort of thing, limit the habitat. And one of the things the dams do, well, a couple of things they do. One thing is that they make it difficult for fish, not just brook trout, but for fish to use the full amount of habitat that's in the stream. And brook trout, in particular, travel around a lot trying to find sources of food, but also trying to find sources of cold water. And The other thing that happens with the dams is, aside from blocking sediment transport and that sort of thing, because they've been in, most of these dams have been in the stream for more than 100 years, sometimes 300 years, like Tack Factory Pond. They filled up with sediment. And so you have these wide sheets of shallow water. And starting in the spring, they start to heat up. And we've actually monitored the temperatures of the water coming out of these dams. And so that, for instance, the water below the Ludham's Ford Dam by sometime in July is hitting 80 degrees or better, which is unsuitable for any cold water fish, and it's probably not very comfortable for most fish. Now, the reason John Rowe is up here is he kept a diary in the mid-1700s. He was an avid fisherman. He did a lot of fishing all over the state, and he fished in some places you might recognize. He fished in Ponkapog Pond, he fished in Great South Pond, but he also fished for trout quite a bit. And he recorded what he caught in his diary. So part of what we're dealing with here is what they call a sliding baseline. And one of the big problems with, and one of the reasons that we started the Sea Run Brook Trout Coalition was we realized that people had forgotten completely about these fish. They almost ceased to exist. And I think so we're going to try to push that sliding baseline back a little bit and to give people a picture of what actually lived here before we started to change things dramatically. So Rowe was a merchant, and he was probably a smuggler. Most American merchants prior to the Revolution had to smuggle because of limits that the British put on their trade. He owned one of the Boston Tea Party ships. He was well aware that the Tea Party was going to take place, and he actually said something about how he was addressing a congregation someplace and said he suspected that the tea would be mixing with salt tonight. So he approved of that demonstration against taxes. He used to go to Cape Cod to fish, but he also fished here in the North and South Rivers system. So from his diaries, here is some catches that he made in Pembroke. And you can see that May 20, here in fact, that he's in May 20, April 30, 1770, and May 15, 1773. Each time, the first time in May 20 in 69, he caught 50 trout. April 30 and 70, he caught 58 trout. And he must have been getting better at it because on May 5th in 1773, he caught 60 trout, which by today's standards, I mean, it's an appalling number of trout for somebody to be taking. And believe me, he took them all home and fed his friends and family and that sort of stuff. And then he went to, at some point in 1769, and he went to Duxbury Mills, and he caught 5 dozen trout, another 60 trout, in other words, in a day. And then he went to the Monument River at some point, and he caught 10 trout, the largest I ever saw, several 18 inches in length. So what we get from this is that there was still a lot of trout around, wild trout, in the North and South River system, in the North River anyway, and in other places around southeastern Massachusetts here. And some of them got to be quite big. Who knows where the Monument River is? Some of you have fished it. Kenny's fished it, I know. Yeah. The Monument River is the Cape Cod Canal. Yeah. So, of course, when you fish it today, you're not going to catch trout in there. You're going to catch stripers or bluefish or something. And on the other end of the Monument River ran down into Buzzards Bay, a large estuary at the end of it. Its original name was the Manomet River, and was the location of one of the first trading posts that the Pilgrims had. So the next person who tells us about the fishery is Jerome Smith. Jerome actually, he went to all the trouble. He was a physician, the superintendent of the Long Island Hospital, and Smith wrote a book called The Natural History of the Fishes of Massachusetts. From a technical standpoint, it was abysmal. The typical doctor, he thought he knew everything, and he actually didn't know much about fish. But one thing that he did know how to do was he knew how to fish for trout. And the whole the 75 pages, the last part of his book, is devoted to that, to the trout fishery. And here you see that in Smith's book, the Fishes of Massachusetts, this last part of it, he's talking about the numbers of trout that they catch. So 80 trout, 59 pounds, Samson's narrows, basket of 70 pounds of fish, often filled in one tide. Pocket point, thousands of trout. And so the fishing for trout that Jerome Smith did was mostly in the estuaries, in the bays. So the two bays that he was fishing in were Quoit Bay in Falmouth and Popponesset Bay. And they would fish beginning in March. Whenever the weather started to get good, they would go down and they would actually, as if you were fishing for stripers today, they'd stand on the edge of a sandbar someplace and they would drift. They had 12-foot wooden jointed poles. Actually, their poles had sand spikes so that they could stick them in the stand to keep the delicate brass reels from getting sand in them. But they would stand there at the edge of the salt water and they would drift what they call minnows, but which were actually mummy chogs or shrimp through these places where, facing into the tide, there would be schools of trout, literally hundreds of trout feeding. And very different from the way that we think about trout fishing today. When we think about trout fishing today, we're thinking about getting out there with a dry fly on a stream someplace and trying to match the hatch. And in this case, they're fishing the same way that somebody might fish small bait for stripers. Then, at one point, Smith waxes fondly about how many trout there are all over the place in southeastern Massachusetts. And he gets to talking about the trout all the way up the coast to Marshfield. And so this is an interesting comment because, of course, Marshfield, the South River runs through Marshfield. So Marshfield, it may be said that the whole country is full of trout. And to come nearer home, Marshfield, of which last, by the way, out of regard to the tenacious notions of such friends as view the ground their own by a sort of prescriptive right, but for which we can feel no sympathy. Obviously, he's not happy about the fact that somebody doesn't want him fishing in Marshfield. So we'll go to the next one because we're gonna talk about that person. The guy who didn't want them fishing in Marshfield was Daniel Webster. And Webster's one of the biggest folk heroes of the old Seaman Brook Trout fishery. He was a statesman orator. He was actually served as Secretary of State under 3 different presidents. He ran for president a couple of times. He was actually asked by the presidents who beat him to take the position of vice president, and he refused. And in both instances, those presidents died while they were in office. He could have been president of the United States if he had just accepted, but he was obviously a very proud guy. But Webster was a nut about fishing. He fished all over the place. So he He fished a lot on the Cape, and the Mashpee River was probably his favorite river. He fished down on Long Island, and that is part of the story. If you read this book, if you get a chance, get this. This is everything you'd ever wanted to know about brook trout. This is Nick Karras's, very hefty tome, but it's got tremendous amounts of information in it. But some of it, at least part of it, is kind of it's kind of a legend more than it is fact. And so Webster is reputed to have caught a 14.5-pound salter from the Carmens River on Long Island, New York in 1827. The funny thing about this is Webster wrote that the biggest trout he had ever caught was a 2.5-pound trout from the Mashpee River. And you would think somebody with the ego of Daniel Webster, if he had caught a 14.5-pound trout, everybody in the world would know about it. So you have to take it from the perspective of the time. Webster was a contemporary of, say, Davy Crockett. So Davy Crockett fixed the crack in the Liberty Bell. Daniel Webster caught a 14.5-pound brook trout. What Webster did do is when he was a freshman representative in the Massachusetts House, he was just there for one term. The only piece of legislation that he produced was a bill to limit fishing for trout and pickerel to a hook and line. So until 1822, you could take these fish any way that you wanted to. You could net them, whatever. And so this was the first fisheries regulation that we had in the state probably for trout. So that's a salter from Red Brook. This is more typical size. It's more like what they really are than 14.5 pounds. This is a pretty good one from Red Brook. There's a bunch of fishermen here, so we knew there would be tonight, so we just threw fish porn out there for people to look at. So in going through this selection of people that we took from the history of the fishery, this is probably one of the most important people on the stage. This is Theodore Lyman III. He was on the first Fisheries Commission that was formed in 1867, and that was the precursor to our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife today. And the reason the Fisheries Commission was formed was because, all those fish that they were catching back in the 1820s and 30s, they were all disappearing quickly. Amongst the things, one of the things that Lyman did was he did get a law. He went to the Massachusetts legislature, and he got them to pass a law that required fish ladders on any dam, or fish passage somehow on any dam that had anadromous fisheries in that stream. Too little, too late for the most part. But at least he got it done. He went to all the way to the Supreme Court with the Holyoke Company on the Holyoke Dam in the Connecticut River. In 1872, the Supreme Court ruled that the Holyoke Company had to put a fish ladder on their dam. They said that they didn't have to because they'd already paid the shad fishermen downstream. They'd paid them for the loss of their fishery. But the Supreme Court said, no, that's not enough. You've got to put, Massachusetts can tell you to put a fish ladder in there. He built the state's first fish hatchery with Samuel Tisdale, who was a Wareham resident at the time. Tisdale actually owned a dam and a tack factory across one of the streams down there. But when Tisdale died, he had to take the hatchery apart and release all the fish that he had in the hatchery. And he released something like 1,000 trout into Maple Springs, and in his journal, and actually I'll have to talk a little bit about the journal. In his journal, he predicted that the fishing in Maple Springs is going to be terrific next spring. I dumped all these fish out of the hatchery in there. He went back the next spring, and in his journal, he notes the next spring he didn't catch anything. So he bought a house along Red Brook, And over 100 years, his family, his descendants, purchased 638 acres along the brook. So they bought this land to save the brook from actually becoming a big cranberry bog. Getting back to the journal, Lyman began writing a journal in about 1867 when he was on the Fisheries Commission, and he maintained the journal right up into the late 1880s, and then his sons and his grandsons maintained the journal right up into the 1970s. So the journal provides us with a lot of valuable information about what happened to our streams and what happened to the area over time as it became more populated. This is the house at Red Brook. A lot of you might be familiar with it. Tisdale and Daniel Webster had leases to fish Red Brook. And at the time that Lyman bought Red Brook and right through up until the early 1900s, it was really a tremendous sea trout fishery. And here again, the way that they used to fish for trout at Red Brook was they would go out to the salt marsh, and they would catch anywhere from 12 to 30, 40 trout on a tide. And some of the trout, there's some cutouts at the house there at Red Brook. Some of those trout went to like 3¼ pounds, so it used to produce some pretty big trout. So what happened to salted brook trout? And these maps actually show what happened to our connectivity, stream connectivity, and how it impacted alewives. But if it impacted alewives this bad, it impacted brook trout even more severely. So over here you see what access anadromous fish had to the streams and habitat, inland habitat, in 1600. And by 1900, this was all that was left. And this is why they lost all that habitat and why we lost most of our sea-run brook trout. The first dam was probably put up in Plymouth, in the town of Plymouth in 1633. And Town Brook, which you're probably familiar with if you're familiar with Plymouth, was a sea-run brook trout stream. There's still occasionally catches sea-run brook trout in Town Brook, and they catch brown trout there from time to time, but it's also stocked, so it's hard to know if there's a wild fish or not. In fact, most people say they aren't. But it's important to note that Town Brook is undergoing a huge restoration, and David Gould and the town of Plymouth have taken quite a number of dams out there. I don't know how many, but totally transformed the stream back into a stream again, except for this one particular historic and scenic dam right here. And the other issue as time went by were culverts. And so within our own watershed here, we've got probably hundreds of culverts. At this point, 63 dams that we know of, and 2 were taken out. And the other thing that impacted our fisheries was the cranberry industry. And the reason for that was the cranberry bogs were put in along the old trout streams. So if you look at the Agawam River, for instance, today, it was a terrific trout stream at one time, right up into the early 1900s. The Agawam River is one big cranberry bog at this point. And when you do that, you straighten out the stream, you plow back the riparian zone, take all the cover away, put in all these little dams, make reservoirs that warm the water, and you end up killing all the trout and just about anything else that lived in the stream. And I think at this point, I've got to hand this over to Jeff.
Thank you, Warren. This is to show you, again, back to that sort of shifting baselines thing, where we had fish and where we no longer have fish. It's also to add a little bit of content for anglers and fishermen women, if you're interested in where do you catch these fish? We'll talk about that in a little bit. So you see with the black X's, those are extirpated. What's left with the red lines are either active salt or brook trout fisheries or are ones under restoration. Red Brook, as you can see, which is right up in the crook of Buzzards Bay, that's a fabulous sea-run brook trout fishery now under restoration for 20 years. Keep in mind it's a catch and release fishery. The other one that's of interest particularly is the Quashnet River. That's also a catch and release fishery. The Coonamessett and the Childs are under restoration now. There are some fish in them, but they are not large populations, so we suggest that you don't try fishing there, but there's no regulations to say that you can't. And the Mashpee River, which we consider a reference stream, and there are no, other than general regulations, there's no regulations there. It's not a catch and release system, but we recommend, of course, that you catch and release in there as well. These other systems, the Pamet, Fresh Brook and Wellfleet, Scorton Creek, the Santuit River, formerly had sea-run brook trout in them. They no longer do, and there may be future restoration projects going on. So one of the reasons that got me particularly interested in this was back in the early 2000s, this gentleman on the right with the watch on and the scalpel in his hand did a genetic study to identify what was going on with these fish. And he identified that the fish in these salter streams primarily were wild. They were unrelated to hatchery-strained fish. That's a pretty interesting finding, but some people say even more interesting than that is that each brook was genetically different from each other brook. So those were strains that had been there populating, living, and reproducing for years and years and years in such a way that they made themselves distinct genetically from others. And that's pretty interesting. It's one of the things that got me particularly interested in what was going on with the salter brook trout. And it's also something I'd like to see more of. We haven't done a genetic study since 2002, but that's another thing entirely. One of the things that Brendan brought when he did the genetic study was pit tagging. And what pit tagging is very much like the fast lane. These are little tiny devices that are planted in the fish. What you see in that last slide was he's planting these tags in these fish. When they swim through these antennas, as you see in that culvert there, they ping the system and you get an identification of to what time and what number, which particular fish went through that antenna. And we'll be seeing more about pit tagging as we go on. In fact, I have a pit tag in my pocket, and we'll talk about that a bit more. So now we're coming to some much more local content. How many of you were involved in the removal of the Tack Factory Dam? Okay, I know it's a small population, but this is before it was removed. I didn't take this picture, but I think it's a great picture of what the dam looked like. I know. And I think that the year before it was removed, there was no water running over it. In fact, there wasn't even any water behind it. Is that right? It's a very interesting kind of a drought situation. And that shows the impoundment. Some people call it a pond. I call it an impoundment. I call it the impoundment behind the dam. You see it's quite stuffed with lily pads and grass, not very fishy. So now we get into some images of what it looks like to do actual dam removal. So this is the big yellow machine after the dam has been removed, and they're sort of moving the rocks around and placing the rocks into the channel so as to engineer the channel in an optimal way. Notice the wide plain of mud there. More of the same, and you see they've moved these rocks to create this hardening along that one side of the dam. And there you see the channel starting to emerge. It's starting to get a little bit more evident. If you look very close, you can start to see the water is clearing, and you can maybe see some gravel through the water. Here again, the slide is the channel is emerging a bit more. You start to see it greening up. This is going back a little bit in time, and this is to show sort of some of the technicalities of what's going on. Notice this brown, it's brown fabric, that's geotextile, and that's used to prevent erosion. But notice also this funny thing here, this funny structure here. This is what's known as a root wad, and we'll be seeing more of root wads as we go on. So you see how it's starting to look really, really nice. You still see the geofabric, but you see that there's wood in there as well. That's probably very likely placed in there by the engineers to create the sinuosity of the channel, and as Warren would say, to add complexity to the river, provide opportunity for bugs to live, to fish cover, etc. Here you see, again, that geofabric, but you see this interesting structure. We're beginning here to build a pit tagging antenna. These are interns that came from the North-South River Watershed Association to help us build this antenna, and that's PVC with that wire is going through it. See them placing the antenna in the brook, and that's the fully constructed antenna with a box that contains the technology that reads the information. It also has several batteries in there and a solar panel to power the batteries, and you see the antenna. So that's a plastic bag containing, I don't know if you can see this, and that's the pit tag reader saying, we're getting a signal. So there you go. So I don't know if you can see this, but this thing is the size of a grain of rice. And when we install these things, we install them using a hypodermic syringe. So what these guys are doing, the man that looks like he's got an astronaut rig on, that's electricity, and he's using a positive and a negative anode to shock the fish. And what's happening is there's a beep, and then he's shocking a fish, he's picking it up with the net, picking up another and putting it in the bucket. And these are wild fish above the Tack Factory Dam impoundment that we're in the process, or he's in the process, I'm part of the crew, we're in the process of catching them and then tagging them, weighing, measuring, and tagging each fish, and then releasing them back into the system, so that if any of these fish get down and below and swim through that antenna at the Tack Factory site, we'll get an indication that the fish, were in that part of the system. And you see there's actually quite a few fish in this system, in this one particular area. They're not very large, and the reason that they're not very large is there's sort of an old axiom that says the smaller the river, the smaller the habitat, the smaller the fish. So these fish have been bottled up in that system, in that very, very small brook for, let's say, 300 years. And they don't have access to the main stem, or if they did, it was a very small part of the main stem that they had access to. That means they don't have a lot of access to food, they don't have a lot of access to other types of habitat, and they're going to stay small. They'll reproduce as a small fish, but they're still going to stay small. Once the dam has been removed, they have access to greater habitat. In theory, they're going to get larger. Now, it may take a few generations before that happens. We don't know. We really don't know. So that's one of the third herring river fish. You can see it's a small fish, but that fish is now carrying a tag, and if we see that fish going through the system, we'll get a read from the pit reader. These fish will live for about 3 years, for the most part. We don't know that for a fact. So I believe this is an actual video on pit tagging, not from that day, but another day. And this was these videos were taken by a Patagonia intern. So what he says is this fish is
in the hatchery this size in about a year and a half, but this one here is probably 3 years old.
3 years old. So that's about at the end of its life cycle.
What's the oldest one you guys found?
About 4. So this one's at 307. I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Yeah, 307 millimeters is about 12 inches, so there you go. So here he's preparing with the hypodermic syringe. There's a tag in there. He's putting it in there, and that's that. No stitches, no special treatment.
How does it affect them, like when you guys
And
insert them?
the dialogue is kind of funny because there are a lot of kids and they're saying, well, how does the fish
How would you
survive?
like to be a brook trout and have an osprey tail and go India? I mean, we've seen some fish here that,
Seriously, that survived something like
yeah,
that?
we actually had
That
them
these
being
fish are
tested.
actually very robust survivors.
So what I do is I put a little bit of alcohol in between the tags just in case there was a disease in one fish. We don't want to transmit it fish to fish. But that little wound there, that's something that fish
So these
can
tags are about $3 each,
take care of.
and we go through about 1,000 of them a year. We put a lot of tags in a lot of fish. So sometimes it's 600 or 700, but it's usually a number of that range. Here's one of our interns writing it down. We got a lot of support from Patagonia one year. It was really a lot of fun. So I want to say thank you to Patagonia, and you should buy Patagonia. It's a good product. We love Patagonia.
When the fish goes through, can they estimate how big the fish is? Is there anything that...
No, you've got to electrofish the fish another time to get that length estimate. You've got to see the fish later on to see. So I want to say that there's something really important here is that the habitat restoration isn't always all about just trout. It's not about satisfying us as anglers. It's not necessarily about fishermen or fisherwomen. It's about biodiversity. And here we have this interesting story of something moving up and down the brook. I assume those are fox tracks. Does anybody have any perspective on what they might be if they're not fox tracks? I always thought that a fox track is walking with that very distinct type of track. I was gonna have this slide without a fox tracks and ask you guys what you thought it was. So this is another impoundment. This one's behind the YMCA, the South Shore Y. And again, it looks pretty ugly. It's muddy, it's grassy, it's weedy. And this is what it's like later after dam removal, just after dam removal. And again, you see the sign of the geofabric. These are core logs. These are also to prevent erosion and runoff. And then over here we see more root wads. So anybody guess what a root wad is going to do? A root wad is going to basically collect mud and debris. It's also going to provide cover for bugs. It's also going to provide cover for fish. And it's very common that this work is done by Mass Department of Ecological Restoration. It's very common that they put in a lot of root wads. So here it is later. And here it is much, much later. And here we have yet another pit tagging system. This is further upstream. A little bit of snow. Again, you see the solar panel in the box and the classic antenna made out of PVC. These are from a North Shore herring run. One of the nice things about herring runs, I find very few things to say nice about herring runs, is they're easy to photograph fish. And this was we have a very, very small herring run on the North Shore, and this was a moment when there were a lot of fish in the herring run. So again, like I said, it's not just about angling, it's not just about brook trout, it's about biodiversity. You've got, in Third Herring Brook, hopefully you've got herring. There you have the herring. So I have a few more things to say. We're pretty much an all-volunteer organization. We work with the South Shore, North-South Watershed Association. We need your help. There's assistance that we're going to need, potentially some very, very big assistance. There are more dams to bring out. That might mean, as volunteers, you can help, and maybe Samantha can say something about that. We're going to need help doing more pit tagging. We're going to need more help building more systems. Removing these dams is a very, very expensive thing, but volunteers can help in lots of different ways. But the net is that as nonprofit organizations, we need help to make these kinds of things happen. So I do want to say thank you. These are people that have helped out with this particular project. We got a tremendous amount of help from Trout Unlimited, multiple versions of Trout Unlimited, the Southeast Mass, National, et cetera. Cardinal Cushing, which is a property owner, Fisheries, NOAA, American Rivers, South Shore Y, and Division of Ecological Restoration, and a great resource from the state of Massachusetts, of course, and the North-South River Watershed Association. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks everybody.